You're listening to the CMR audio project. The CMR is the Institute for Coastal and Marine Research at the Nelson Mandela University. I'm David, or Dave if you prefer. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the CMR, and today's guest is another postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Denning Metuge. Denning's specialism is the law of the sea, and that's the topic he kindly explores for me in this interview. All views and opinions expressed during the CMR audio project interviews and conversations are those of the participants alone and don't necessarily reflect any official positions of the CMR or the Nelson Mandela University. All episodes of the project are available for download at archive.org. Head over to archive.org and search for CMR audio project and you should find what you're looking for. Please do feel free to contact me with any questions or comments by emailing cmraudioproject@gmail.com. So let's just jump straight into some of the questions I want to ask you. You are a doctor, academic doctor, who studied the law of the sea. I must admit, I don't know very much about it. I kind of feel like I should. So you're going to fill me in on that. What should I know about it?
Okay, I'm going to try to break it down. You need to understand that it is the branch of public international law that consists of the norms that regulate relationships between states. So the interaction between sovereign nations at sea is regulated by the law of the sea.
You're studying how different nations, or have studied, how different nations regulate parts of the ocean that they have jurisdiction over, and then the implications for when a ship comes into those waters, or what the state or nation can do with regards to the waters, what's in the waters, what's below the waters, the ground, the ocean bed, minerals in the ocean bed, etc., right?
Yeah, something like that. The law of the sea determines the jurisdiction at sea. So it would say for South Africa, for example, the jurisdiction which South Africa would exercise at sea, the maritime zones that South Africa may claim, is determined by the law of the sea. And based on the international provisions therein, it regulates the relationship between South Africa and non-South African states that are engaged within South African maritime zones and within the sea at large.
Who are the kind of people who are interested in these sovereign nation state size issues?
It goes beyond just sovereign states. You should bear in mind that international trade, a significant percentage of international trade, I would say over 80% of it, is conducted at sea. So you also have private entities that have an interest that there should be order at sea because they've got ships with cargo transporting merchandise from one continent to the other. So basically anyone who is involved as a lawyer to begin with, as owner of a fleet, shipping fleet, people involved in trade have an interest in being aware of regulations at sea.
So where could those private entities go wrong? What could they do that contravenes, I want to say maritime law, but it's not maritime law, it's law of the sea, right? Where could they go wrong?
Okay. Where they could go wrong is in the sense that we humans rely on the ocean for its resources. So depending on our interaction at sea, we could deplete our resources if we are not checked. We could pollute the ocean and then resultingly affect the resources which we depend on at sea. And because international trade at sea involves moving from one jurisdiction to the other, people involved need to be aware of the different domestic rules that apply when you enter a maritime zone belonging to a state other than yours.
It seems like a bit of a blurry boundary, though, because you're out at sea. So there's obviously charts that tell captains of ships that they're entering the waters of another sovereign nation. But I suppose it goes deeper than that, because that blurriness then becomes relevant when you want to draw the line between the jurisdiction of one nation's waters versus another nation's waters. So, for example, Mozambique, where does South Africa's waters end and Mozambique's jurisdiction begin?
You see, it's just so hard to oversimplify the law of the sea because it is everything but simple. So with regards to determining where the Mozambican maritime zones begin and they end, the framework instrument that regulates activity at sea is the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Indeed, it is referred to as the Constitution of the Ocean. And the reason for this is that it not only sets the framework into which other related and more subject-specific international instruments apply at sea, but it also determines the length and breadth of maritime zones that coastal states may claim. So I can't really tell you where Mozambican maritime waters begin at the end, because that will require me to go deeper in my explanation of the provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention. And I would not like to overwhelm you or those listening at the moment with all the details.
Well, the details are interesting, and I suppose it's a really appropriate figure of speech to say go deeper when we're talking about coastal and marine style issues. I was quite taken by what you just said. You said that the ocean has a constitution. I didn't know that. What can you tell me a little bit about the ocean's constitution?
So it's the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So as I said before, because it involves sovereign states and also other elements of international law that are called into play when sovereign entities or when interactions involve one jurisdiction to the other. There are several other laws in place. It's not just one law. It's quite complicated in a way. However, all other international instruments fit within the framework of the Law of the Sea Convention. For example, if within a specific maritime space in South Africa, the provision is that South Africa has sovereign rights, exclusive sovereign rights to exploit the resources in that maritime zone. These other international instruments provide now for specific aspects of exploration and exploitation within that specific zone. So everything is not contained in the Law of the Sea Convention, but it provides for consideration of other international instruments, especially those that have been accepted by nation states.
I must say it sounds like a bit of a can of worms, one that I would generally try to stay away from. So could I ask you, what drew you to this can of worms? Well, it seems like something, certainly, as I've said, I would like to avoid, because it seems like a lot of gray areas. But what would draw a person to this kind of complex topic, one where surely you're going to have disputes between nations about what's theirs and what's their right, and you're getting very deep into the field of law here. So what took you here? In
all honesty, I was just being pragmatic, because as a lawyer in undergrad, I was in the class with over 250 students. Everyone wants to be a lawyer, but how do you distinguish yourself in this field? That's the question I would ask myself. So I realized in the field of marine law, the law of the sea, I'd never met a marine lawyer or heard of one even at the time. So I told myself, if I'm going to go forward in this profession, I would want to find a niche, a place that's not overcrowded, somewhere I can grow and insert myself as a leading expert in the field. So it drew me into questions. So I did a master's degree that had a Law of the Sea component involved. And after that, I would say youthful ignorance, the assumption that it's easy. Yeah, it allowed me to venture in there. So I would say ignorance also helped, because being aware of everything I know now, I'm grateful we don't see the whole picture, because it's quite a lot, but so far it has been a worthwhile journey, and I'm really enjoying it.
Good to hear. Yeah. I was going to ask you later what advice you have or might have for any younger students or students studying their masters when it comes to studying further and maybe being interested in the law of the sea, if that's the direction they should go. You've mentioned, I think I could summarize it as specializing, focus on some kind of niche category. That's excellent advice. But then you also said ignorance. And I don't know if that is advice, right? You can't advise someone to be ignorant.
I would never advise anyone to be ignorant.
No.
As a lawyer, that would be sacrilegious, because ignorance is not a defense to begin with. But I would say this: there's still room for many to specialize in the law of the sea, especially from an African perspective. Most of the literature you have out there, the prescribed materials that we engage with, most of them are authored by European or American authors, and they tend to have a Eurocentric view of regulation at sea or approaches to marine regulation, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But there is a time is at hand wherein we need more Africans to engage in the field, provide an African voice, and be able to provide advice for the development of the law of the sea going further, because it's an ever-evolving field. Because as humans evolve, the law needs to evolve with them to ensure that order is maintained. So we need more people, especially in Africa, because we have such a vast maritime domain as a continent as a whole. So there is so much we're still to learn about it, and we need to build capacity to protect our maritime zones for the continent as a whole.
So there is a gap in the market of marine law, of coastal and marine policy. Okay. Earlier you said something about pollution and private companies. So I wonder if this is a good time to ask about potential overlaps with the law of the sea and maritime law, or rather implications for environmentalism.
The law of the sea includes the marine environment. That's an environment. The earth is not just the land. If anything, the land portion of the planet is the smallest, has the smallest proportion to the planet. There's more ocean than there is land. So we have a vested interest in protecting the marine environment, not only because of the wealth of natural and living and non-living resources that we gain from the ocean, but also for issues such as climate change, but I'm not going too deep into that. We do a lot of exploitation of marine resources. In South Africa alone, the fishing industry employs over approximately 40,000 people. So imagine a situation wherein, due to the interaction between humans and the marine environment, resources are depleted, pollution affects the livelihood and the productivity of resources. Not only would some people, coastal communities, suffer because of hunger, because that's a source of food, a direct source of food for them, but employment as well. So we do have a vested interest in preserving and protecting the marine environment as much as we protect the land environment.
It's a prominent theme in coastal and marine research, and I think there's a lot of people in the ocean sciences working on that very question about protection, conservation. Yeah. I don't know if I should be somewhat cynical here and ask you a difficult question. Again, I'm offering perspectives that do not necessarily reflect any official position of the CMR or Nelson Mandela University, but my own research into environmental policy hasn't exactly left me buzzing or optimistic about changes to our trashing of the planet. That seems to be a default systemic approach to doing business. So it seems a little to me that policy and governance and, dare I even say, law are sometimes biased towards growth, the debt-based economic system, if I can use that phrase, which I think is often disastrous for the ecology of the planet. How would you respond to this slightly cynical perspective?
Well, David, I would not agree with you, nor will I object what you're saying. But from a legal point of view, from a legal point of view, as far as I know, within South Africa, from the Constitution, there is clear language that is pro not only developing the environment for economic purposes, but there is explicit language requiring that the environment needs to be preserved for present and future generations. So the issue here may not be a lack of legal provision to ensure that there is sustainability of the environment. It would come into implementation and other issues that are beyond the scope of the law. But I do hear what you're saying, because the environment is crying, for lack of a more appropriate term, because of pollution. There are incidents globally, even domestically, there are incidents that show that the marine environment is suffering from pollution. But I think at this point in time, it's more an issue of implementation and enforcement than a lack of legal provision to secure a healthy environment.
Would you say that people interested in the law of the sea and maritime law, environmental policy, might play an important role in translating some of what is in the Constitution, which sounds very good on paper? Would you say that they play an important role in translating what's on the paper into practice?
Not translating per se, maybe explaining. I know the words may seem similar, but for someone who does the law, we need to be careful with the words we use. Explaining maybe, because you need to bear in mind officials who have the duty to apply these laws, to implement them. Some of them may not fully understand the terms of the law. So yes, there is room for specialists to advise on the interpretation of provisions, not from a personal point of view, but from a legal perspective, how provisions should be and are interpreted, and the effect the law hopes to have in its application. There is room for that. And that is why we do what we do. That's why we do the research we do, David. That's why we write articles. We read these laws. We look at practical issues and try to reconcile how can issues of overexploitation, for example, be controlled. In South Africa, most recently, there has been the publication of the Marine Special Planning Act. And the purpose is to manage marine special planning in South Africa. It regulates the relationship between the various users of the marine space, as well as the effect of human interaction, the resources in the environment. The aim is to strike a sustainable development of the marine environment. So from a legal perspective, and from the South African point of view, a lot is being done in terms of law, at least, to ensure that the environment is not overexploited to the detriment of protecting and preserving its resources.
You've mentioned some of the research that we do. You said that's why we do it. One of the focal areas of this audio project is to focus on why you do what you do, and you've already touched on that, so thank you for that. I'd like to ask about two of the publications that I've seen you've written. Safer Waters from Hague to Rotterdam stands out, and then also the South African perspectives on port-state jurisdiction.
Oh, wow. The first one, Safer Waters from Hague to Rotterdam, it had to do with carriage at sea. So the liability of the carrier at sea. And that was, it was my dissertation actually when I was doing my master's degree back in 2012. So that was like my first small steps into venturing with law at sea. But this in effect is maritime law. It had to do with trade. It had to do more with international trade than the law of the sea per se. The next one, the South African perspective on port-state jurisdiction, that is smack in the heart of the law of the sea convention. Port-state jurisdiction is an enforcement jurisdiction. So it's authority that is granted to the port state to enforce international pollution provisions that it has adopted in its domestic law. And it may enforce these provisions against foreign ships that commit an illegal discharge outside of its maritime zones before coming into a domestic port in the port state. What is special about port state jurisdiction is that, in principle, a state may not enforce its law over incidents that have occurred outside of its jurisdiction. But port state jurisdiction gives the state this special enforcement power to sanction foreign entities that come to domestic ports after violating an international provision outside of its jurisdiction. I'm sorry, David. I don't know how to make it more clear.
No, that sounds perfect. Could I make it a bit more practical and say, so you have party X and party Y. Party X is on a boat and they want to do a drug deal with party Y. And they can do that drug deal out in non-controlled waters, but then they have to come back into the port. Is that a way of thinking about it? That as soon as they enter then the jurisdiction of the nation, that they are then subject to that nation's laws?
In this case, it's not about drug deals. It's about pollution at sea. So the aim of this jurisdiction is to prevent pollution at sea. But again, as I mentioned, you have other instruments that would deal with drugs that are applicable at sea because the convention makes room for the application as well.
Yeah, that is quite technical. Let's remain technical here and briefly mention SOLAS. Is that the right pronunciation?
SOLAS, the safety of life at sea. That's what it means. It's an acronym, safety of life at sea. That was part of my PhD thesis. It had to do with safety of navigation at sea. That's what my doctorate thesis was on, the safety of navigation at sea. And SOLAS, as you see it represents the safety of life at sea convention. Basically, it regulates the conduct of ships at sea. That's to take things short. It provides for safety measures that the ships must be compliant with before they're allowed to navigate at sea. So I'm not sure how far you want me to go with this.
I'd like you to go a bit further because safety of life at sea could apply to so many things. You know, is it to do with ships passing each other at a safe distance, or the people on the ship who have to wear life jackets, or the captain who has to not be too overpowering and psychologically harm the crew?
It has to do with a lot of that. It has to do with the environment within which the seafarers live. It has to do with aids to navigation that a ship must have. It has to do with equipment that the ship must have, life-saving equipment that the ship must have, and things like that. It's quite vast. But basically, the ship and its crews all have to be certified in terms of this international instrument before they can leave any state and any port. There are certain technical requirements that must be met in terms of the construction, design, equipment, and the manning of the ship.
If I could change attention then onto something that you're doing more concurrently, which is the marine law policy course that you are teaching at NMU. Could you briefly give me some highlights of the course content?
The intention with this course is to provide the students with basic knowledge of marine law and the environment within which marine activities would take place. So the students are introduced to the historical development of the law of the sea. They are introduced to the exercise of jurisdiction by states at sea. So they learn on what does jurisdiction mean when it comes to the law of the sea? Who can do what, how, and where? And the aim is that by the time they are done with this course, they'll have the tools necessary for them to identify basic legal issues that might arise at any given situation at sea. And if at all they're involved in the industry, they will be well informed to provide input in the process of formulation of new regulation when it comes to marine law.
I'm going to skip over some of the questions I had left for you because we're running out of time. So I'll just finish with 3 brief questions. The first one is, where do you see yourself after the postdoc?
At the moment, I'm enjoying doing research. So I'm hoping after my postdoc, I would continue that. I would continue producing output, research articles, and most importantly, I would like to lecture, because the aim of doing this is to empower others to do what I do, and hopefully even do more than I do. So I'm hoping to have the opportunity to do much more of that after the postdoc.
Yeah, I fully identify. Second last question, do you have any recommendations on books, documentaries, films, or anything that you might think worthwhile for people to expose themselves to? So you can just add anything here. It doesn't have to be about law of the sea, just something that you're interested in.
What I do when I'm not doing the law of the sea, I go on YouTube and I just try to know what's happening in the world. Watch YouTube videos.
Don't do that, man. I mean, isn't that just opening the cage to an onslaught?
No, the thing is, that's my window to the world because I spend so many hours reading and writing. I feel left out. So in my own way to be like, I go online and I wonder what's happening today, what the news say. I don't read everything. Sometimes the headlines are the same, so I don't stress myself to look at them.
Yeah, after this whole COVID thing, I'm trying to stay away from news, but let me not get started on that. Last question, how can we contact you?
I'm with the South African Chair in the Law of the Sea and Development. That's at Ocean Sciences Campus at Nelson Mandela. And we have a website. I stand to be corrected, but I do believe I've got an email address on there. And also through the Chair's administrative assistant, you send them an email and they'll be able to get to me.
That brings us to the end of the episode. If you have any questions or comments, please do feel free to send them to me at cmraudioproject@gmail.com. You should receive a reply at some stage from either me or a relevant guest. All episodes of the CMR Audio Project are available for download at www.archive.org. Head over to archive.org and search for CMR Audio Project and you should find the right page. If you would like to download an episode, you can do so at that website, and detailed download instructions are available at the CMR website, cmr.mandela.ac.za. Many thanks to the extremely talented Kendall Beeden, who composed and recorded the theme music for this audio project. Kendall's email address is kendallbeeden@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, may the tides of life treat you kindly.